Hello, I'm Alex Palanak and I'm Head of Sanctuary at the University of Leicester. Welcome to this presentation, which is the first of a series of 4 videos which forms part of a set of training materials on the topic of working with trauma in the Refugee Language Classroom. These materials are geared towards ELT practitioners of ESOL and related fields, such as English for academic purposes and English for specific purposes. But others working with refugee background students may also find much of the content useful. Before I start, please note that some people may find some of the content triggering or upsetting due to references to traumatic events and some of the negative effects that trauma can have on people's lives. If this happens, please feel free to take time out from the material, and you can always return to it at a later point when you feel ready. So, in this first part, we will focus on the need for this training. In part 1 of this presentation, I will outline why this training is needed and then explore what refugee trauma is and some of the common causes, and then move on to explore how trauma typically presents in the ESOL classroom. So to give you a bit of context about the need for this training, the big picture is that by the end of 2020, 82.4 million people worldwide had been forcibly displaced. And in their resettlement country, their priorities are typically things like being able to function in daily life, navigating essential services, making friends, building social and functional networks, gaining employment, and accessing education and training. But in order to do these things, they often need to improve their proficiency in the language of the resettlement country first. However, many refugees face challenges to improving their linguistic proficiency. The one which will be addressed by this training is outlined here in a nutshell. We know that refugees tend to have a far greater mental health need than the general population, and that they have higher instances of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. We also know that PTSD has a direct detrimental effect on refugee language learning. However, due to the additional challenges posed by this, the situation is that many English language teachers feel unable to support refugee background students adequately. This can partly be seen as being due to the fact that very little research and practitioner training currently exists with this specific focus, which is trauma-informed ELT for adult refugees, which facilitates both language learning and well-being. Looking at this in very simple terms, we can say that exposure to a potentially traumatic event can lead to PTSD in some people, but not in all people, because there are a range of individual and environmental variables at play which affect whether a person goes on to develop PTSD or not. So just because someone has been exposed to a potentially traumatic event doesn't automatically mean that they have PTSD. In terms of potentially traumatic events and compounding factors which refugees may have experienced, it's quite useful to regard these in terms of those which occurred before someone arrives in a host country such as the UK, and those that occurred after their arrival, some or all of which they may still be experiencing. In terms of experiences before arriving in a host country, the most obvious ones which tend to spring to most people's minds are things like war, persecution, and torture. But some common experiences are much less obvious and include things like loss of support networks and physical and psychological health issues exacerbated by lack of access to adequate healthcare support in their home country and on perilous journeys to relative safety. So it's important to note that the combination of these potentially traumatic events will be different for each individual, but this slide just gives you an idea of the most typical ones. What's not generally so well known is that refugees' experiences of potentially traumatic events and compounding factors often don't end when they enter a host country such as the UK. Many people will be suffering intense anxiety about family and friends back home, They might be very lonely and struggle to adjust to the new society and the language. They might experience discrimination or hate crime. They might struggle with the delays brought about by the current asylum system, which forces them to live in indefinite limbo. So these are some of the things that refugees have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, which can have a negative effect on their psychological well-being and exacerbate the trauma. So let's now take a look at how exposure to a potentially traumatic event, like the ones we were just looking at, can combine with other factors to bring about a traumatic or chronic stress response. As we've already seen, this process begins with exposure to a potentially traumatic event, which can be a stressful, frightening, or distressing event or prolonged traumatic experience. So some people may then go on to develop PTSD as a result of this, and this then can lead to traumatic or chronic stress, which is similar to an exaggerated fear response that can't be turned off. This traumatic stress response can be made worse for some people by the repeated stress that they might be exposed to through re-experiencing their trauma through recurring intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, and nightmares. So the very symptoms or the presentation of PTSD can contribute to making the situation even worse for an individual. For some people, this can also be exacerbated by various daily life stressors and also exposure to further potentially traumatic events. So all four of these things can contribute to exacerbating traumatic stress symptoms, and as we've already seen, this can have a direct detrimental effect on refugee language learning. So what exactly is psychological trauma? Well, it's an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, a rape, or a natural disaster. And immediately after the event, it's quite common for people to feel shock and denial. But then some people experience longer-term reactions, such as unpredictable emotions and flashbacks. And then for some, these feelings continue, and they can then have difficulty moving on with their lives. So trauma affects different areas of the brain, as you can see from this diagram. First of all, there's the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with rational thinking. When affected by PTSD, this becomes less able to regulate emotions such as fear responses. In terms of the hippocampus, this shrinks as a result of trauma, which has a negative impact on memory and the ability to differentiate between past and present. And the third area of the brain that's affected is the amygdala, which becomes hyperactive and acutely wired for survival, and people can then struggle to switch this off. Here are some of the more common presentations of PTSD in everyday life. As you can see, these are quite varied and include avoidance behaviours such as avoiding thinking or talking about the trauma and avoiding people, places and activities associated with it. Many people are easily frightened or startled and tend to be on guard much of the time because of this. There are also various examples here of negative mood and thoughts, as well as sleep issues. In terms of how trauma might present in the classroom, there are a few things that you might want to look out for in your students. So, for example, many trauma survivors are in semi-permanent fight or flight mode, and this might lead to difficulties paying attention, just generally feeling restless, having heightened alertness, high stress levels, and just generally feeling unsafe, which might come across as a fear of risk-taking, of speaking in front of others, trying new things, and maybe not wanting to work with other students in class. There are also certain topics or activities which may act as trauma triggers, and these might lead to students experiencing flashbacks or panic attacks. And some students may end up having extreme reactions to discussions or activities. They might get very upset or angry. And others may overshare traumatic stories in the moment, which might have a negative impact on themselves and others around them. There are also various avoidance behaviours that you might want to look out for. Things like being absent, being late, avoiding tests, avoiding certain activities or people, perhaps even spending excessive amounts of time on a mobile phone, which can in itself be a type of avoidance. You might also notice students shutting down from constant sensory overload, which might come across via rocking, fidgeting, seeming not with it, and not being able to express emotion. These can affect a student's ability to pay attention and remember lesson content, so you might find that content covered in class is not absorbed or retained. So we've touched on a few behaviours which can potentially be signs of trauma. Of course, we can't always be sure whether these are as a result of trauma or something else. However, as we can see from Kirker's point in the bottom right corner, we can't automatically assume that these behaviours are a result of problems with motivation or discipline either. They might actually be a student's survival mechanisms instead. So it's useful to be aware of these possible signs of trauma so that we can keep our minds open to the possibility that this might be the cause of some or all of these behaviours. Here's the list of references related to this Part 1 presentation. If you're interested in reading more around this topic, I'd recommend the first 3 references on the list. We've now reached the end of the Part 1 video on the topic of working with trauma in the Refugee Language Classroom. I'd encourage you to now go back to the self-access materials and take a look at Task 3, which will help you reflect on the content of this video and prepare for Part 2. So in the Part 2 video, we will explore some useful trauma-informed mitigation strategies that we can use in the ESOL classroom.